In James chapter 5, God commands us to have the patience of Job as the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Be ye also patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. Verse 11, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. So in this passage, God commands us to endure affliction, that is the affliction of Christ, by having the patience of Job. In this regard, we endure by preaching the latter-rain gospel, which produces fruits of salvation just prior to the coming of the Lord. In Job chapter 29, verse 23, God informs us that Job was used to bring that latter rain. There we read, and they waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouth wide as for the latter rain. Now we know from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 2, God typifies rain as his doctrine. And so, at the end of the Great Tribulation, God is going to pour out the latter rain so that we can instruct many by helping them to understand how God's judgment will come on the church and how God will save his elect after they leave the church. But before we get into how God used Job, that is God's elect, to instruct many, we need to go back to the book of Job to understand how Job endured affliction at the hands of Satan. In Job chapter 1, verse 9, we discovered that God used Satan to test Job's patience. When Satan made the accusation, does Job fear God? The point being, we must not fear him who can destroy the body, that is Satan and his ministers. Rather, we must fear him, that is God, who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. In Job's chapters 1 and 2, God uses Job to demonstrate how Satan was loosed during the Great Tribulation to afflict God's elect in the church. And in this context, the church is typified as Uz. Uz being one of the nations that was forced to drink the cup of God's wrath, during which time it was ruled by the king of Babylon, that is Satan. With that idea in mind, we come down to verses 15 through 18, where we read that Job's possessions and his family were destroyed by the Sabaeans, the Chaldeans, fire from God out of heaven, and a great wind. Spiritually speaking, the sword of the Sabaeans represents the word of God, as we read in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12. The fire from God representing judgment, the sheep representing God's elect, and the camels representing the methodology by which the gospel goes into the world. And lastly, the four winds that struck the four corners of the house represent the Great Tribulation. And recall, similar language is found in Revelation chapter 7, verse 1, where we read that the four angels held back the winds at the four corners of the earth in order to seal God's elect before the Great Tribulation began. These spiritual pictures are used to demonstrate that God is no longer using the church to save his elect, typified as sheep, nor is he using it to take the gospel into the world, typified as camels, which in Esther chapter 8, verse 10, were used to send a message of deliverance from Haman, who represents Satan. But here in Job chapter 1, All of those elements of the gospel are taken away during a time when Satan is allowed to afflict God's elect, typified as Job. Now, it's very interesting that we find those same elements of judgment in Daniel chapter 11, where we read that those who were used to instruct many will fall. In Daniel chapter 11, verse 33, we read, "And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity, and by spoil many days." Now, how does this idea of instructing many relate to Job? Well, it's very interesting. In Job chapter 4, verse 3, God says very plainly that Job would be used to instruct many. "Behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands." So when we consider this in the light of Daniel chapter 11, verse 33, we see that those who instruct many would fall. And they fall by the sword, which reminds us of the Sabaeans who used the sword to destroy Job's servants. Moreover, it says they will fall by the flame. And of course, that refers to the fire of God, which destroyed Job's sheep. And again, these sheep represent God's elect. Moreover, they fall by captivity. And according to Job chapter 42, verse 10, God characterizes Job's affliction as a time of captivity. And lastly, we read that they would fall by spoil many days. And this reminds us of the Chaldeans who stole Job's camels. And the camels, remember, represent the sending forth of the gospel. And so God is simply teaching us in Daniel chapter 11 that those of understanding who were used to instruct many regarding the abomination of desolation, as recorded earlier in verse 31, that they would fall at a time when they would be afflicted in the same manner that Job was afflicted by Satan. And it simply indicates that while they were trying to bring the gospel in the church, they fell because they were trying to bring the gospel in an environment where Satan had been given rule. Now the question is, how do God's elect endure this time of affliction? How do they recover from this fall? Well, just as in the case of Job, in Job 19, verse 25, Job declared firmly that he knows that his Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand in the latter day upon the earth. And then in verse 26, he recounts the affliction that he suffered in his body. "And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God." This is the message that James chapter 5 is teaching when it says that we must have the patience of Job. We must endure that affliction right up to the time when Christ returns. And until such time, we are commanded to send forth the latter rain gospel. Remember, Job was used to bring the latter rain. Job was used to instruct many, even as he was being afflicted by Satan. And that's precisely why Matthew chapter 24, verse 14 says that we must continue to preach the gospel into all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, we close our study by going to the last chapter of Job, and that is chapter 42, where God says that Job's captivity came to an end, and all of his possessions were restored, many of which were doubled. In Job chapter 42 verse 10 we read, "And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. He gave him twice as many sheep and twice as many camels, the sheep representing God's elect who become saved during the latter rain, and the camel representing the fact that the gospel is going to go into the world right up to the end." And so anytime we think about the end of captivity, or that God will bring again the captivity, we know for certain it refers to a time of salvation, as we read in Psalm chapter 14:7 and Psalm chapter 53 verse 6. And so, if we were able to endure the afflictions of Christ by continuing to preach the gospel right up to the last day, we give evidence that we exercised the patience of Job. However, if we begin to teach that there is no salvation, we give evidence that we did not endure to the end. We did not continue to boldly proclaim, as did Job, that I know my Redeemer liveth.